Gareth, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a really enjoyable morning so far, listening to all the conversations. I think one thing I take from it, I think I reflect back on your presentation earlier this morning, David. We've been on a journey for a number of years with developing regulations, legal frameworks. And then in the last 12 months, so much has happened in such a short space of time. It's been a period of huge uncertainty, almost uncertainty shock, I would say, if we go the first quarter of this year. I think where we spend a lot of our time in, I think, Deloitte on the auditing and the professional services is now looking forward. Okay, what will Omnibus deliver? What will the future of data and data collection look like? I think we heard some really interesting presentations on that this morning. But also strategically, how will we navigate through this over the next 2 to 3 years? So as a financial community, how will all these political, geopolitical issues, what will they mean to strategic decisions? I think we have a very interesting short, medium-term period ahead of us.
But will you be doing similarly to, going towards minimizing risk more, given the uncertainty that you'll be changing the way you're working towards more safe spots in a sense?
I think the risk has been there the risk has always been there. So we talked before, so the physical risk, the transition risks, they're not going away. So I think that's something that continues. We have to keep understanding what the risk dimension is. But then I think it's also the opportunity dimension as well. So technology is still moving. So there's still new innovations coming through which tackle some of the adaptation and mitigation issues. I think the world is still moving. The world is still innovating. The world is still developing. We just need to understand and navigate the geopolitical and legal dimension.
And the fiduciary duty.
Absolutely.
As well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I agree with Gareth that there has been a lot of stress in the system, obviously. I think during Q1 there was a kind of fight or flight situation well, maybe inaction or taking radical steps in that environment is not the best way of moving forward. Now I think that we have had a lot of discussions around the global alliances for both for asset managers and for banks and revised the requirements there. But I think now we have landed in a situation where many banks have reconfirmed their long-term commitments. We're continuing to moving forward. We're seeing a lot of good progress, good examples in the Nordics, which is reassuring because the media landscape has been so biased during this period that the good examples have drowned in all the negative examples. So
can you give us some of those examples?
Well, I think just if you want the positive examples, I think what we're seeing among our Nordic customers is that just as you pointed out, that they have already embarked on this transition journey, so they are continuing now, and they firmly believe that there is a business case for it. They will be winners in the long run, and they will keep on transitioning. And we see a lot of customers showing that continued commitment. And I also think that there is a big difference between the development in the US and in the EU, where in Europe there is still there is an increased polarization for sure, but still a consensus on the end goal. We need to transition, we need to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. That is not a conflict, but then we might discuss when and how to do that. And I think coming to terms with that dialogue, and now the focus on competitiveness for European companies, we of course support that. We want our customers to have the ability to transition in a good way and stay competitive. But at the same time, I personally feel that CSRD has helped us as a bank in integrating sustainability in our processes, having the dialogue with the board on our long-term commitments, etc. So I think striking the balance there on what we want to achieve and how to handle the sort of the commercial angle and the need to actually manage the risks and transition. I think that's where we stand now. And among European and Nordic banks, there's still a strong commitment to continue towards the long-term commitments we have made.
Good to hear.
So maybe just following up on both of your reflections and asking you to kind of reflect on something that we've touched on it. Multiple people have touched on it in their presentations, but going back to the simplification process and sort of the effects of that, and coming back to what David said, showed this basically in this process now of deregulation, sticking with the ETS, for example, but starting to weakening or at least loosening up these more enablers. Now, enablers are sort of the soft law, and it's all about sort of information gathering in a sense. So I want to come back to what you're saying, because I know you have a background in risk as well. As we do that, or as that seems to be unfolding, and we now see basically only a fraction of the companies operating in Europe that are reporting, the large companies, what does that concretely mean for your ability to assess risk in a reliable way going forward? Either of you, anyone can answer, but I'm just looking at Anja and Gareth.
I can start maybe. I mean, obviously, well, my personal take on the simplification package. I mean, from the beginning, there was a question around transparency, risk awareness, and making sure that inertia in the short term is not a competitive advantage, right? So the simplification package now has taken a different approach and just taking the scissors and cutting out a large chunk of the companies in scope. And of course, the concern for us as a bank is that we still need to have ESG-related risks from the business that we do, and we need to have data to assess those risks. So regardless of whether companies are in scope of regulation or not, they will be required by us and other banks, financial institutions to have some kind of basic knowledge on their ESG-related risks.
I would very much echo what Anja says, because I'm quite concerned about the exemption of small companies, because also in general, when we think about the company journey, and especially when we think about the smaller company eventually becoming larger and becoming a listed company, the sort of disclosure, transparency and governance requirement is part of that journey, right? And for us, this discussion around reporting in the ESG space, which very similar to the discussion we've had forever with many of the smaller companies. Oh, do I need to do all these things just to be listed? And we said yes, because this is part of what you need to do to actually attract capital from a more diverse pool of investors, including retail sources, etc. So there is a maturity journey which I hope will not be abandoned, because it goes actually to more spaces than ESG. And coming back to Anja's point, it was really a mixed bag how companies took on the reporting requirements. But for many, it actually helped them to think through risk and exposures in a way that actually they had not done before. And it would be a waste to actually throw away that knowledge.
But in my reflection back then is I think that's, for me, heartening to hear that in some regards, okay, the official sort of, or not official, but from the EU side, it might be weakening, but you guys will stand strong and still push for that same sort of information anyway. So we're not sort of abandoning it. The system is not abandoning it. It's just coming in a different form. And also, I think, back to the Draghi report, which talks about competitiveness. Yeah. For me, it sounds like, this in itself, this training, if you will, of ESG reporting and understanding that that's a fundamental part of your business, that is competitiveness as well. And so these are not in contrast with each other, contrary to how it's sometimes phrased. I see you nodding.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, over to other people to pose questions or reflections. We're in the business of reflecting here.
I'd like to ask you about the speed of change that you see that is market-driven, more or less. And I'm thinking that, yes, we have a very turbulent time with tariffs and all that. But as a company, you're used to investing in and developing your business under uncertainty. And if you have uncertain situations and you manage it one time, the next time it will be easier, it will be faster. And Do you see that now, or is it still sort of that people are sort of paralyzed by all the stuff going on in the...
I would say that it's a very mixed bag. Again, you have companies who take on this challenge, who just decide to run faster and really make this an integrated part of their business. And then there are others who are sort of paralyzed, or at least not really able to take on the sort of challenges we see. And it goes from the board down to the sort of everyday operations of the firm. So as owners, we see much more of a divergence, which comes back a little bit to the sort of potentially the need to be more picky about some of the companies we invest in, because this is a sort of a differentiator that you don't see the same way when everything goes smoothly. So it's both and, if I may say that.
And I think maybe you said it, David, about re-anchoring your values and understanding what is the strategic purpose of your business model, right? So this is what you need to do when there is turbulence of the kind we have seen recently. Go back and see what is right for us, what implications will that have in the short term and in the long term. So then you need to act on both horizons in parallel, and popular expression right now, but you need to keep more than one thought in the head at the same time to navigate when the volatility is as high as it is currently.
I think it's two reflections. I think one, I guess a comment I made earlier, I think very similar to your observation. It's uncertainty shock. I liken it to the biological term. Some systems go into overdrive, some systems shut down. And I think that's, depending on where we are in parts of the economic value chain, that's kind of what we saw earlier this year. Now it's regulating. Things are getting a little bit more into steady state, but yeah, we have some uncertainty ahead. But then the other reflection I thought is, if we just take the sustainability word out of the discussion just for a moment, a lot of the activities that we're seeing in the corporate market, it's innovation, it's good business practice. There's economic value being created through in these areas, and that continues. And I do recognise, I think, some of the points we saw earlier of the divergence we see in those who have invested and those who have not. But there is still economic value which is being created. I think the presentation we had earlier of ESG is political. If there's a way to separate that a little bit and get back to economic principles, there's still huge activity running, I would say.
Please.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi.
Can you just say who you are?
Yes, definitely. Jalil, ISS Stocks. Thank you very much. Really, really good reflections. I agree with Beatrice that it is heartening to hear that despite deregulation and simplification, that we do need obviously ESG data, and we do need to take a step forward and make sure that we continue on this path. Without getting political, obviously, but a personal reflection is from the first Trump administration is what I feel that we saw a lot from the asset manager and asset owners, particularly in the Nordics and investors, was a real reaction to that, to step up in an organized way and work or drive the sustainability questions when we didn't maybe have the leadership kind of from the US back then. This time, partly because of maybe the shock, as you mentioned, I just feel that there is maybe less of a kind of a tangible and organized response to that. So I just wanted to hear, do you have any reflections on what the private sector, what asset managers and asset owners can do to respond to this in a more impactful manner? Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to start. To me, it comes back to the fiduciary duty, what you can say and what you can't say, and what kind of change you are driving through which sort of channels. Because at any for any sort of development, for you to have I would say, a valid say in that, it needs to impact whoever's money you're actually investing, which is obviously any sort of political development would do. I personally feel that it's important to have real impact with whatever you do, so to avoid kind of reacting to headlines, reacting to the first news flash before you actually have seen the substance of things. So I think there has been a bit of a I wouldn't say a wait and see approach, but definitely to think smartly about which levers can I push here, which is actually which keeps my credibility also. And how do I engage with an individual company, maybe to ask, why have you decided this course of action in response to this political development, rather than going out and fight that fight in the newspapers? Because as Anja pointed out before, I think there's been an avalanche of negative news, and there's been a real push for a quick response, which might not be the ones that creates the relationship for the longer term. But it's certainly, I would say, behind the, so to speak, not closed doors, but in all conversations I have with other banks, asset managers, etc., there's a lot of discussion. How do we do this in the best way? But I think there's a deliberation to it.
And I think also that what has happened during the past years, and even before the changed US administration, is that the scope from sustainable finance to transition finance has developed, which means that we as a bank or as an asset manager, we support companies in all stages of transition, even the ones that are less mature and starting on their journey now. And maybe that might be perceived as we're lowering our expectations, but it's actually how we take responsibility. We want to make sure that our investee companies and our customers really start on the journey, and we need to be there where the market is. That's where we need to be with our operations to support in a relevant way. We cannot disconnect from where the market is. So if transition is slowing down, we will see other risks evolving, like physical risks, and climate adaptation finance will be even more hot topic. But we also need to continue supporting companies where they actually are, and not where we want, not just the ones who are already where we want them to be. So I guess that might be a bit of what you're seeing in the changed sentiment currently.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, I think one extra point. I think your question, how can the private sector support, what actions can they take? I think one is we just continue the urge for transparency. So regardless of where we end up in regulation, just that transparency of information, it will support decision making across the entire value chain.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we can continue doing.
So I have a question coming into this around, I mean, we've talked a lot about the politicization of ESG in general, but also different areas that are coming in and becoming more hot topics and such. I was wondering, how do you balance between the very many different aspects of sustainability and what is valued and what is most important, top of mind? I'm thinking about, I'm hearing stuff about, the ESG, MSCI and those, they're American vendors. And they are also connected to the politicization of CSR and what is put into their metrics. And so I've been hearing stuff that we're taking out, for example, issues around Gaza and Israel, that's coming out, that's being taken out. We won't even consider that. For example, how do you look at your ESG data that you're using to evaluate companies and sectors and country risks even? It's very easy to say that we're anchored in our values and so on, but new topics are coming up, and we very often take the ESG metrics as science. But the human element, the politicization, different values are coming into this.
If I may start, I would argue that this is no different from other areas we're working in. Because when it comes to any sort of data or index provider, the underlying sources, the construction, etc., changes all the times. And the same way you need to be on top of all of a sudden Spotify shows up in the Stockholm Stock Exchange instead of the New York ones, you need to have a firm grasp on the data in the ESG space that you're actually buying. And depending on which sort of regulatory requirements you have different sources of freedom in terms of which data sources you use, etc. But I would say that ESG data is still under development, so you always needed to be on top of what's the data quality and how are you using that data. So I would actually say that it's nothing new, because also already before you had new data coming in, etc., and you constantly needed to validate the quality of that data.
But I would push it even further in saying that, if you look at the metrics there, the environmental and climate, the E part of it is much more developed than the social parts.
That's very
right?
true. Yeah.
So how do we value and what is it that we think is most important?
You need to think about what's material to your portfolio. So even if you have a data, it's the classic thing, right? Do you look where the light is shining, or do you look at the dark area where actually all the risks are? And I would say that's something to be aware of, that even though the environmental issues might be where the light is heading, you need to look at the dark corners.
So I'm going to pick up that and just react quickly to that, because Lynn and I have this conversation all the time. I would argue that there's a minute portion of the environmental E that is in light. Let's face it, nature and biodiversity, all those things has not been in the light. We're talking about climate, so let's not equate environment with climate, because it is one dimension.
But we call it E, right?
I know, I wanted to, and while I'm talking, think and pose questions to the panel as well. But, sorry, Mark. But now I'm already started. Yeah. I wanted to take sort of a systems perspective and say, so we've heard this morning from several that on the one hand, nature and the environmental, we have environmental impacts. They are rising. Those risks are material, and they remain material regardless of what the CSRD happens. But we also saw that social risks or human rights related issues, for example, really coming up, but they're related. We haven't talked very much about how those are related. And the fact is that we know that environmental change is driving lots of different things, including things that result in mass migration. And that's what's partly fueling the human rights related issues that we're seeing. So given that, and some of those operate on longer term scales, but they're definitely connected. At the same time, we're saying everything's costing more now because of these risks coming at us, so we can't afford to deal with ESG. I mean, I know that you guys don't necessarily think that, but how in the space that we're in now, how do you deal with the fact that these are interconnected risks that play out more and more rapidly, but still over longer time scales than quarterly decision making? And so, any reflections on how can we deal with this? Because it becomes a catch-22, that if we don't deal with the ESG, we're just fueling the risks down the line, and it's going to end up costing even more. Kind of like the Stern report said, 15 years ago now.
I'm not sure I have an answer, but I have lots of questions to it. And the way we go about asking those questions is that, especially for the companies where we hold larger portions of shares, I would say we sit down with management a number of times a year, and we go through a set of questions, and those questions would be part of that. Yeah. And it might not be, because sometimes you need to ask the question in a different way. So if you, for example, ask a CEO, how dependent is your business operation on clean water? And you either get the blank stare, because frankly that happens, or you get someone who has really thought through all the different, and it could also be, and then you continue asking that question from different angles. What sorts of materials do you use? Where do they come from? And you kind of come through the value chain, and then you will get to that sort of awareness in an indirect way. And it's by no means perfect, but you certainly get the feel for how aware are you on top of these issues? And you very often see progress over time. So when you come back a year later, they're like, look, we actually thought about that. And now this is what we did. So I would say patience and lots of questions is at least the best way forward I've figured out so far. But I'd be happy to hear about better ones.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a quick solution that you can provide us. But yeah,
maybe I can just add from the banking side, since we have so many corporate customers, we need to look at a sector level and for portfolios and analyze the materiality. Because as you say, we cannot do everything everywhere. We need to focus on where we have the most material areas of potential impact and risks. And as a bank analyzing risks, that's our backyard. Like that's what we have done forever. And now ESG is coming into all different risk categories. So we're all learning. All risk managers in Nordea are now learning to add the ESG factors into their risk analysis. But I think what we need to do is to focus on the sectors where we say that we have the most material impacts and start on that level in analyzing the more complex systems, including the value chain and the different dependencies between the social, nature and the climate-related factors. So that's our top-down approach to get the most bang for the buck of the capacity that we have.
Yeah. But it's good to hear that you are thinking in terms of these interconnections between the E and the S, because I don't hear enough about it really in the open debate or in news media.
But also changing towards, we're talking a lot about risk here. And of course, it's in the financial market actors. Do you see any move towards, I mean, if you're going back, in some sense, picking more safe options, but are you also seeing a move towards more impact investing to, going towards the opportunities rather than the risk?
Well, here I need to have full disclosure. Risk for me is two-sided. Okay. Risk is not a negative word. Risk can be upside risk or downside risk. So risk is also an opportunity. So we're talking about the same thing.
Because addressing the risk is an opportunity, right?
Yeah, and there's plenty of upside risk if you're a winner in the space.
Yeah, but you end up very often negative screening more than the other way around, or no?
It depends on which part of the portfolio we're in, and I could talk so long about this. So you'll never get to lunch. But it very often is both and. But for certain parts of the portfolio, it's more about actually negative screening, and for others, it's more about the positive impact. And it depends on who you are as an owner in the different situations.
Did you want to, or should I go to Mark? Because we've got, and then we have another one from the audience.
Good.
Okay, good. Yeah, my name is Mark Sanctuary. I'm one of the Sustainable Finance Lab members / team members. And I'm not going to let you off the hook there. You said you were to talk about some of the nitty-gritty. I'm going to ask you a question related to that, but it's open to any of you. I'm a bit... it struck me when we're talking about the need for information in order to assess whether or not you're going to invest, and the fact that we're cutting out a big share of the companies that are going to be subject to disclosing ESG type metrics. Would suggest to me that, well, this is increasing the dark space. The light's not being shone on the sector, on the industry in the same way if you do this cutout. And I'm wondering how this can you give me some idea about how this translates into your investment strategies? I mean, one thing that I would expect is that you guys are going to start charging more. You're going to ask for a higher cost of capital in order to compensate you for the risk, which would suggest maybe that it's harder for these smaller companies to obtain good financing terms, which has competitiveness impacts, which has macro implications and so forth. That's maybe an obvious example, but I'm thinking maybe you could help us understand how it is on the front lines trying to navigate these risks, and at the same time you're getting the blinkers put on and you don't know where the risks are for a whole bunch of these companies. How does that translate to what you're doing where the rubber hits the road?
I'm happy to take the equity side, and then I'm leaving the debt side to Anja. So on the equity side, it's exactly as you say, because to be able to be an equity investor in these companies, because obviously we do not come in at the early stage. We're too much of a whale, I would say, in terms of size to be able to do that sort of investment. But what we certainly want to see is that you have a small listed company or companies that it's about to be listed that eventually grows, and we can support it and we can bring in other owners. And that sort of journey, as I said, yes, I think that will be hampered if you don't have disclosure. So I think that will go against the sort of maturity journey we want to see in companies. And I think these are for perfectly good reasons. You don't want to put additional burdens on, but it's growing pains, right? And you need to go through that stage to actually mature. So I'm quite concerned, and I think it's quite hard to see how this squares with other ambitions within the European Union, for example, about getting more equity capital into firms and being less dependent on debt financing. So I'm personally a bit concerned there.
Yeah, and on the bank side, I would say that we have a huge data gap as it is right now. We use a lot of proxies and modeling, and if we talk about climate first, because that's most mature, we already knew before the simplification package that a large proportion of our portfolio will not have customer-centric data. So, and then what kind of thinking does that drive on our side? Well, we need to look at the progress, like how can we improve the proxies, make them more relevant to our markets, and see how our portfolio develops over time rather than looking at the absolute numbers, right? That's how we can see the difference. And then on the nature side, of course, a totally different data landscape, a really low availability, and also quite fragmented in terms of what to measure. So there, I think, like research collaborations and looking at how we can find relevant metrics. But I think we will be reliant on model-based risk assessments for this area, regardless of the CSRD, because there's still a lot of companies that will not be in scope.
So following up on that, or did we have a question there first? Please, but I can take that in the end.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm Jenny Gustafsson. I'm Executive Director of the Council on Ethics, and I work for 4 of the AP funds, including Kristin. Yeah. So I have my boss on stage, ultimately. But I have one reflection and then one question for the panel. Just reflecting on data, I come to you from the trenches of ESG engagement dialogue and also mapping service providers. I just want to emphasize and stress the importance of knowing what you buy and realizing, not the least on the social side, that their qualitative sort of assessments and analysts doing a lot of the work beneath the metrics. So know what you buy, and you're referencing, your changes to an ACWI index, for instance. You have professionals and you yourself know why changes are made and what that will imply. So just stressing that is so important to know what to buy.
But that was exactly my point, that you have human beings sitting at, and making those judgments and what goes in
exactly.
there.
And a lot of the ESG work has moved into the quant teams, which is very relevant. It's an indirect drivers for change, I would say, when you have that movement, but not necessarily engagement or sustainability specialists who understand what's beneath the data. Yeah. So in order to really strive for impact, that's important. But then my question to you, in light of all the turmoil, and I think that was discussed in all the presentations today, that we're facing a very uncertain world. Have you done any short-term changes to your approaches or organizations due to the stage or the state that we're in right now? Thank you.
Well, I can start by just saying that yes and no. We have during this spring had reason to go back to our strategy, like I said, and see what makes sense for us in the long and short term, reconfirmed our long-term commitment. But then we have also, and we are in the progress now of reviewing our defense sector policy for obvious reasons with the development there, and also taking into consideration the the geopolitical development and the energy security perspective, we already in late 2024 did some revisions of our fossil fuel sector policy as well. So some adjustments, maybe not affecting our business that much now, but just as we talked about before, to be able to support our customers where they are and to be relevant on the transition going forward, and to support also like the European agenda of competitiveness and being the sort of responsible financial partner that we want to be. We think this has been necessary, but on an aggregated level, we have the same strategy as we have had since we started talking about sustainability.
We've had some changes, and I would say also some discussions that kind of show, at least made me very happy about how these issues are maturing. So just to give you an example, after the sort of turmoil around tariffs and also the way the US dollar behaved this spring, there's been a huge discussion around how US assets perform and how much of that you should have in your portfolio. And then one of my macro guys says, but if we move out of the US, and then our carbon footprint will go down. But it's important that everybody know that that is not because the companies did something differently. It's because we changed our regional allocation. And then I was like, yes, that's maturity to you, right? Because that means that mindset of it's actually important that it's a company transitioning, not that you move out because you don't believe in the US dollar anymore or wherever it is, that's what actually driving your metrics. So that was a glimmer of hope, and I was very happy about that.
It's like the companies are outsourcing their negative. Very similar.
Yeah, and I think very similar response, yes and no. So if I look at what I see across the corporate market across Europe, okay, maybe some very specific regulatory-driven actions may be paused, but longer-term strategic journeys, no. I think those investments are continuing.
We were talking about opportunities as well, and then I mentioned before the move from sustainable to transition. I think that's where we can really focus our bank offering to offer solutions to drive the transition and to have sustainability-linked loans, etc., to incentivize this transition among our customers. So this is also something that we are working on developing and making it more relevant to the current business climate.
Yeah. What worries me often is if you follow the COP meetings, for example, one's gone from investments in mitigation to basically to adaptation. Very much. And that worries me. Have we already, I think you were in on that, David, a little bit of that we've kind of given up on the 1.5 degree goal and just kind of, okay, we have to deal with the consequences, basically. So I'm a little afraid that we're losing the mitigation part of it. But you had a question to David, I
think. Yeah, I just wanted to bring David into the conversation. It's difficult if you're not been in the space of sustainable finance or finance too. Yeah. But so just coming back to what I was saying before, how the E and the S and probably the G, but they're interconnected. But from your perspective, from the legal perspective, how or if, could you explain if at all there is the connectivity is captured also in the legal frameworks, and can we look for support there, or can you give some examples in how the legal system also addresses the interconnections between this E that drives the S and so on?
That's an excellent question, and I think the simple answer is no. I don't think we can look for support in the legal system, because I think experience tells us that politically challenging issues that politics find too complex or too ideologically contentious to deal with, they are often left to the legal system to deal with, and that includes conflicts between different things that have been coined in terms of rights. So social rights versus ecological rights, for example, property rights as we have it. I mean, we can see that politics is currently really unable to deal with things that has to do with conflicts between green transition and property rights, land ownership, agriculture,
Trade-offs.
Trade-offs, essentially, yes. Priorities and trade-offs. I mean, we can see there is really a war ongoing when it comes to Swedish forestry. It has been for long, but it's more acute than ever, I think, right now. Agriculture is also one of those sectors that are extremely sort of charged. A lot of emotions, a lot of tensions. Politics are really grappling with it. It ends up in the courts, in the legal system, to try to do these trade-offs, because it's essentially, I mean, law, when it is applied, is about trade-offs. It's about allocating rights and obligations and finding some kind of balance point that can be sustainable in some sense within the system. So in a sense, in a practical sense, of course, the legal system deals with those issues because it has to, but I'm not sure that the outcome is always that good for the overall sort of sustainability transition. But,
no. Interesting. Yeah, it was just an attempt to also bring in the legal perspective here. And I know Jonas Ebbesson, who you know as well, has been trying to sort of see if the legal system can actually reflect this more resilience thinking.
So may I ask a question for David? I have a question for David. So especially in the Swedish context, there's been this discussion also around the Miljömålsberedningen and the different types of permitting, etc., how you don't manage to trade off environment versus climate, etc. Do you see any progress on the Swedish legislative front? Because at least there, I think there's been an awareness that these goals might not be completely balanced, even within just climate versus environment and biodiversity, for example.
Yeah. So I'm currently in a research project that looks at sort of consistency challenges between climate and biodiversity. So that's very current, of course. And I have actually a paper coming out on conflicts between water protection management and bigger sustainability transition. So of course, these are very important issues. They are hard. I don't think there are, or I don't see sort of overarching system-wide solutions. I rather think that we need to address those as sort of an issue-by-issue level. I think there is a maturity. You talk about the maturity in how companies think and operate. I think there is an increasing maturity also in the way that sort of regulatory processes work around these issues. There is much more awareness of the need to balance. But as we've talked about this morning, I mean, there are so many different processes, so many change processes, so many conflict areas. So it's really hard. I mean, we have this Swedish system with remisser. So as a university employee, I'm supposed to respond to a number of governmental inquiries. And I mean, there is an avalanche of these inquiries. And you realize that one inquiry is not even sure what the other one does, or they are actually given their instructions is you should keep out of that area because it's dealt with by someone else. So,
and then no one listens to the.
No, I mean the complete picture is often missed out. So I think I think science in this sort of social sciences now is used to sort of problematizing and finding problems. But I think now we have a great opportunity and a challenge in sort of mapping and trying to grasp the macro pictures and see how different policy initiatives and changes and risks sort of exactly what you talk about, how they interrelate. And there are very few people who really have sort of the perspective and the time to try to do that. But I think when we link up different scientific disciplines and also industry actors, when we link up and we have some time, we can really contribute.
And that's what we're trying to do in the Sustainable Finance Lab.
Excellent. Yes.
We have some feedback into our next research agenda for the coming 5 years.
And just really shortly now from you, can you, from your perspectives, tell us what you're missing in the research around sustainable finance? Give us input on what we should be looking at that you would need to support your work.
Yeah, I can start because I have something top of mind. Like, I mean, we're looking at the long-term perspective here. So the young people now and the coming generations, what kind of incentives do they need to do their personal transition, or maybe what kind of financial services and support can incentivize them in taking their responsibility? Because to push transition, companies can do a lot, but as individuals, it's about the mindset of prioritizing sustainability and sustainable lifestyle. So that's something that I am thinking a lot about, like how to attract or how to increase. I know there's a lot of focus among the young on environmental topics, but what can we as financial sector do to support and further incentivize that kind of behavior? That would be really interesting to see in research.
A big discussion in my world, which would be great to see an academic kind of shed a more thorough light on, is how do you define fiduciary duty in this world? There's a big discussion about among UK pension funds, for example, that you should not only have assets to retire with, but there should be a world worth retiring in. So in some areas there's a broadening of the concept of fiduciary duty, while others are narrowing it down to a very sort of narrow financial perspective, and also different time horizons, etc.
I think about Bob Eccles, and that's all he does.
Yeah,
he's involved with the SFL.
That sounds great, because that's really something that will also shape the marketplace, because if sufficiently much of the capital has a different perspective or a new perspective, that will also change the investment landscape. Yeah.
I think I would go a little bit more kind of quant based, I think, in some of this, but I think more research, more into correlation of various quantitative factors on outcomes. So looking at moving from carbon into energy, looking at other risk drivers and correlating those with various.
But not causation, correlations.
Correlations. Just so I think again, how can we in the banking and the investment world, how can we then include these in the existing valuation models that we use?
I say yes, and let's partner to find the data to do that.
Final word from David?
Well, I think, of course, younger generations always pose challenges because we don't understand them. I think that's sort of perpetual. I see with my own kids, they're very committed in environmental issues and other sustainability issues, but they think about it very differently than I do. And I mean, I focus on institutions and processes that seem sort of dated in their eyes. But I think for me as a lawyer, what is sort of making my world shake is when you challenge, as I see strong forces in the US, not least, is doing now, is challenging sort of the basic preconceptions on which we have built our civilization since the 1950s. So for 75, 80 years, it's been a focus on rule-based sort of decision-making and transparency as something that is desirable. But now we see tendencies that no, this is not the rule of the game anymore. I mean, we don't want transparency, but transparency is an obstacle for power. So I mean, if we're turning that way, I think much of how we are used to think, we need to sort of fundamentally rethink things, and that takes time, and it's going to be nasty. So I'm not sure we're going down that way fully, but if we are, I think it's going to have really profound implications for how we think as lawyers, how we think as individuals, how we think as businesses.
About democracy.
Definitely. I mean, we heard about criticism towards democracy as slow-moving, as unpredictable, etc. Of course, yes. I think those of us who have an understanding of what can happen when democracy goes down the drain, we are prepared to pay that price, but not everyone are. I mean, it's...
Gareth, Anja, Kristin, David, Bea, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Great.